As a part of our growing commitment to education and training, USITT is providing this webinar as a way to help people in the industry grow the necessary skills to not only survive, but thrive. This webinar, OSHA in Your Theater, is led by two well-known experts and OSHA Authorized Trainers, Joe Aldridge and Eddie Raymond. I will now give screen control over to our instructors to begin.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Joe, why don't you introduce yourself?
Joe Aldridge, retired University of Nevada, Las Vegas professor emeritus, 25th president of USITT, OSHA outreach trainer for about the last 10 years, and a retired stagehand at a local 720 in Las Vegas. And a number of other things, but it's not important right now.
You're modest. My name is Eddie Raymond, and I am the retired Vice President Training Director of IATSC Local 16 in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm the past president of ESTA and sit on, as Joe does, on the ETCP Council and among a whole bunch of other things. And as Christine mentioned, we're both OSHA outreach instructors. We're going to talk about this in two parts. The first part we're going to cover specifically, it covers OSHA. And the second part, we're going to talk about ANSI regulations, mostly that are for the entertainment industry, that are reference documents for OSHA when they come face to face with the kinds of things that we deal with on a daily basis in our theaters. So I'm going to hand this to Joe. And Joe, I have control, so you just let me know when you want to change screens.
All right. As you may or may not be aware, OSHA covers most all employees in the United States and its territories. It's overseen by the OSHA Occupational Safety and Health Administration. There are four primary sets of regulations covering general industry, construction, agriculture, and land-based maritime. The ones that refer to our industry specifically are 1910 general industry and 1926 construction. And those are cited being in a state that has its own state OSHA. We have a law that requires all entertainment industry individuals to have an OSHA 10 or an OSHA 30 to be able to work in this state. So these take on different meanings to us, and we'll talk about those further down the road. Okay, Eddie.
So ANSI is the American National Standards Institute. The documents that are ANSI standards are consensus documents, which means they're written by people who have a concern for the subject matter being covered within any given industry. In the theatrical industry, especially in terms of technology and services, ESTA, the Entertainment Services and Technology Association, is the secretariat for ANSI in terms of things that apply to our industry specifically, and we'll go over a lot of those later on as we go. OSHA uses ANSI standards as reference within the regulations. They couldn't possibly write a rule for everything that goes on in every job everywhere. So many of the references to OSHA regulations are to other documents that have been written by other groups, including NIOSH and ANSI and other standards writing bodies that cover the specifics of an area that may not be written up in the OSHA regulations.
As we've discovered, a lot of universities will think that everybody's covered under OSHA rules and regulations, and they're not. Had an instance on campus at UNLV. The theater department was doing a production of Peter Pan, and a parent filed a complaint with OSHA about scenic elements being flown over the students' heads and thought that this was dangerous. So Nevada OSHA was obligated to investigate, and they asked me to come in as a friend to the court, if you will. And I went in and we discovered that the general population isn't really aware of what OSHA refers to and what they apply to. And it was soon made known that while there should be a concern about the protocols and the work practices that are going on, that OSHA doesn't apply to volunteers, and that this student and their parents didn't really have a leg to stand on in the court, if you will. fortunate enough, we were able to prove to the OSHA compliance officer that the theater department had a set of protocols that they used, and that they were following them stringently, and that nothing was moving over anybody's head. And so some theater management may wish that to apply the OSHA rules, which are OSHA regulations, to everything that goes on in their venues, which is not a bad idea, but just know that the students themselves, unless they're working for the university, aren't covered under OSHA. In my case and in Eddie's case, we've both done something that we did it a long time ago. We became friends with our local OSHA compliance officers. You know, and I did the same with my fire marshals. It's always good to have them in speed dial so that you can call and ask a question and be able to get an answer relatively quick. They know you're calling with something serious, or you wouldn't be calling. And it helps save you time and headaches in the future if you've got an established relationship. Let them know some of the industry safe practices that you're employing in your theater. Give them a tour and explain what each component does and how you use and train to use each of these safely according to the industry best practices. A number of years ago, while TD for the theater department, I had a fire marshal come in, which was great. He walked around for 2 hours looking for obvious violations. And after a couple of hours, I stopped him in the middle of the stage and I said, you know, we've been here for 2 hours and you've yet to look up. I said, if you do me a favor, look overhead. He looked overhead and said, okay, it's dark up there. And I said, right, it's dark. But what you need to be aware of is there's about 20,000 pounds of potential death hanging over your head that was hung by human beings. Now, to help relax you a little bit, we do have protocols in place so that we do this safely and we do it correctly and nothing goes up overhead. But don't always look down, just look up. So giving them an opportunity to understand what it is that we do in the theater helps them to understand and help keep us safe as we're working.
It's a good idea to download the ANSI standards that we're going to be talking about. They are free to download. There's an insurance company called ProSite Specialty Insurance that underwrites the free downloading of these standards. They will ask for your email address when you do so, but they're great reference documents and you can use them as teaching tools if you're in a university situation. And the website is tsp.esta.org/TSP. And you go to the published documents page on that and you can scroll through all of them. And then when you click on one to download, it'll ask for your email and then it downloads as a PDF. So I encourage you to do so, especially if you, as we go through them, you find ones that are relevant to your work.
State plans or OSHA approves workplace safety and health programs operated by individual states or U.S. territories. Currently 22 state plans covering both private sector and state and local government workers. And there's 6 state plans which cover only public and local government workers. State plans are monitored by OSHA and must be at least as effective as OSHA in protecting workers and preventing work-related injuries, illnesses, and deaths. Excuse me. As I said earlier, Nevada is one of the few states in the nation that has a law that states that all workers in the industry have to have an OSHA 10 or an OSHA 30 card. You might have a bad idea if you have an OSHA plan, a state plan in your state, to know how that works and how it affects you as a worker. Understand that OSHA always, Fed OSHA always can trump what's going on with state OSHA if they're not following the rules compliant-wise. If you look at the map on your screen or the layout, you'll see everything in light gray or light blue is a state that's covered by a state plan. Everything that's in a dark blue is covered under Fed OSHA, and everything in striations is covered. It's where public employees only, private sector employees are covered by federal OSHA. So take a minute and figure out if you're a state plan and find out where your local find out where your local offices are. May not be one in your town if it's a smaller town, but it's good to know, and it's also good to know what region you're in the Fed OSHA and what the regional offices might be. As we do OSHA 10 classes and OSHA 30 classes, we one of the pieces of homework that we give to the participants is that they have to find the phone number for their local OSHA office and put it into their phone so that they have it available to them on speed dial in the event they have need to call somebody. Because of the uniqueness of our industry, we often need to ask for clarification of a standard and how it applies to our operations. OSHA, when asked, will supply a letter of interpretation to help clarify the scope and intent of a particular standard. In 1997, an officer of an IATSE local in upstate New York, in an IATSE local union, asked about the use of a climbing belt as a positioning device in fall protection for truss follow spot operators working at heights from 75 to 150 feet. OSHA replied with this letter of interpretation. You also ask what regulations apply to rigorous truss spot operators and others in theater who regularly climb at heights 75 to 150 foot range, and whether a climbing belt that is used as a positioning device can no longer be used as fall protection device. And a full body harness would be an appropriate fall protection device for working 75 to 150 feet. OSHA is concerned with the safety and health of all workers in the entertainment industry, although OSHA recognizes it's not appropriate to put guardrails at the edge of stages. Theatrical employees need to be protected from all occupational safety and health hazards. One specific regulation in 29 CFR 1910, which is general industry, .28A23, the use of handrails as fall protection on the leading edge of stages is expressly exempted. So if you have a local authority having jurisdiction, or you have someone in your school that says we got to put a handrail up across the front of the stage to keep people from falling down, that's not true. OSHA doesn't require it. In fact, they've exempted us. Eddie. This section requires employers to provide protection for each employee exposed to fall and falling object hazards. And unless stated otherwise, the employer must ensure that all fall protection and falling object protection required by this section meet the criteria of 1910.29, except that personal fall protections required by this section meet the criteria of 1910.140. Section doesn't apply to portable ladders, nor does it apply to fall hazards presented by the exposed perimeters of entertainment stages and the exposed perimeters of rail station platforms. Now, there's another interpretation letter that I didn't post that states that in our industry, actors are being trained through the rehearsal process. So if they're not going to have handrails or guardrails on the downstage edge of a platform instead of stairs, they don't need to have them during rehearsal, but they're being trained to understand that. They do state, however, that workers installing that need to be protected and temporary guardrails have to be in place. So that's a little bit of clarification for the no handrail clause.
I actually have experience in this, in that in the San Francisco Opera, we had a compliance officer walk through consultation and pointed out that our lighting technicians and lighting designers and things were working on platforms not during rehearsals or dress rehearsals, but during setups and load-ins, that they needed to be protected one way or another from falling off of objects that were 6 feet or higher. They suggested temporary railings. You can use restraint devices. You can use fall arrest devices. It depends on the circumstance that they're working under. So they have adopted that rule there, and it's doable. It's not easy, but you have to think outside the box to get it done. But it is doable. So
OSHA compliance officers have the ability to apply the set of standards that they feel most closely applies to any given situation. 29 CFR 1926, construction is generally applied to situations where scenic elements are being constructed or installed, scene shops and load-ins, outdoor arenas and other outdoor venues where temporary or portable staging is being installed. Once the show is installed and once the set is installed, then we revert back to general industry. Sometimes we're our own worst enemy, in that several years ago when the young lady fell to her death at CA, at the MGM Grand. The MGM Grand and Cirque were both cited under 1926 when they protested and said, clearly this is a theater. If you've ever seen the show or seen anything about the show, it doesn't look anything like a typical a proscenium or black box theater. There's no stage as such. There's a big open space with a lot of industrial looking machinery around. And so Nevada OSHA decided that 1926 applied, and that's what they would have to follow. So it's up to them. Once it's been installed, yeah. Once it's been installed, then you revert back to 1910.
Thing to remember is that OSHA is going to apply whatever rules seem logical to them under the circumstances or what you think you're doing. And they're all parallel rules, horizontal rules. So if there's a rule written in 1926 and you're doing something in a general industry for which that rule would apply, they're going to reach over and grab that rule and use it. So, you know, the best thing to do is obviously take the safest approach we can at all times. And when you're in doubt, ask. Standards, we're going to go through a bunch of standards now, and these refer also back to OSHA regulations. Again, if you wanted to download these, the website's on the screen there. You'll get a copy of this webinar, so you'll have it again there. But if you put in tsp.esta.org and go to documents, this is what's going to come up. ESTA has 9 working groups that write these standards. We have a controls protocol, which writes the protocols for our computers that run our lighting, things like that. Electrical power that deals with how we apply the National Electrical Code and other things within the entertainment industries. So we have an event safety one, which is currently working to take the event safety guide that's written by the Event Safety Alliance and turn it into OSHA standard. Basically every chapter in that will become an OSHA standard. We have a group that works on floors, how floors are constructed, how strong should they be, how slippery should they be, how do we verify that we've met that rules. We have a group that works on smoke effects on stages, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We have a group on follow spot positioning, which is really a construction standard for where follow spot position should be positioned and what goes into them and what safety things should be taken into account. We have photometrics working group that deals with the specifics of lighting instruments and how much light do they put out and how do we measure that and what's the quality of that light. We have a rigging working group, which deals with all things related with rigging, both manual and mechanical rigging. And then we have a stage machinery group that writes the standards for stage machinery, things like lifts and automated scenery. So what follows is a sampling of those standards. And again, you can feel free to download standards and get all of the specifics about them. And I'm going to reiterate, these are good teaching tools for if you're teaching a specific thing about rigging or stages. They're a reference tool, and there's every one with a glossary, and in that glossary are going to be the terms that are used in the entertainment professional industries that will deal with those particular things. So the first standard I want to look at is E1.41, which was rewritten in 2016, and it covers manual counterweight rigging systems. Within the standard talks to not only the system itself, but all the auxiliary hardware that goes into doing a rigging system. So shackles, batten clamps, chains, etc., and how they're supposed to be used. Talks about lock rails. What are they intended to support and how much weight? Most of the people I do a lot of theater rigging inspections, and I can tell you that many theaters misuse the locking rails on our counterweight systems. They're only designed to hold 50 pounds of out of balance load, nothing more than that. The rail itself is designed to carry no more than 500 pounds by itself, not the lock, but the rail. There's another section in there that's about documentation and labeling, which is extremely important in that we understand what the capabilities and limitations are of our systems so that we don't overload them at any given time. In section 7 of that document, it talks about inspections. How often do you inspect? What do you inspect? When you're doing those inspections, what are the kinds of things that you should be looking for so that you can head off a problem before it happens? Yeah, there we go. Powered hoist systems. This has a lot to do with design and manufacturing, and probably isn't going to fall under your purview. However, it does talk a lot about inspections as well and about maintenance of those systems. So if we're using them for lifting or suspending loads or as part of our presentation systems or for theatrical production, need to have a regular inspection and maintenance schedule. And you'll find with almost every single one of these standards, if inspections are required and maintenance is required, so then is a log into which you write down all of the things that you do, when you do them, what you found, what you did about problems that you found, so that there's a paper trail of these things, and you can show that you're demonstrating due diligence, the piece of machinery that you're in charge of. E1.6.2 actually specifies the design, inspection, maintenance of electric chain hoists that we use in this industry. For example, every manufacturer will tell you with their systems that they need to be factory inspected once a year. No matter how often you use it, they're supposed to have a tag on there that shows that they've been inspected once a year. And it's not uncommon for these things to be not inspected at all. Again, if they're subject to rough use, which most of the ones in our industry are not, then they need to be inspected more often. But it details what kind of things you have to do. We hang these chain hoists off of rigging points, support points. So anything that we're suspending a load from falls under this category. It's important to understand the design criteria that are required for specific uses of a point. This has to do with not only the capacity of the point, but the angle from which we're hanging. And it also deals with how often do you inspect them? What do you look for when you inspect them? And if it needs maintenance, what kind of maintenance should you be doing on those sorts of things? Really good thing, because we all suspension points and support points throughout our theaters. E1.22, fire safety curtain systems. This is a great one. Again, in doing theater inspections around the country, I can't tell you how many times I've gone into a theater where they haven't run their fire curtain for years in some cases. And when we do run them, they fail more often than not. So one of the things that goes into these things in fire support curtains is that they're supposed to be run. And this is going to come up in our next thing. The fire safety curtain system is going to fall under the NFPA rules, which is the National Fire Protection Association, for fire doors and other protective openings, because the fire safety curtain has to keep the fire from spreading should a fire occur in a theater. Wrong one. The rule for your fire safety curtain is that you need to inspect it. That means pull the pin or trip whatever the tripping device is for your safety curtain and let it run as if you had an emergency once every 30 performances and at least once every 90 days, whichever comes first, so that you can verify that it works according to the spec. And if you read the E1.22, it will tell you what all the specifications are for the different kinds of fire curtains that we use in our different theaters. So it's really important that, again, because this is a requirement of the standard, that you maintain a log that says this fire curtain was last tested on March 13th. We pulled the pin. Time from breaking to floor was 7 seconds. Our dash pots are all fine. We the curtain the way it's supposed to be. The recovery system worked well, and we'll do it again in another 30 or 90 days. Slipperiness of stages. In the floors working group, they actually have a concern that the different things we put on our floors affect the slipperiness of those floors. And one of the things that came up was, how the heck do we determine whether or not our floors slippery. So they came up with a system by which they could actually measure what that slipperiness is, the coefficient of friction, and ways to test that, so that then when you're doing that, particularly with things like rake stages or when you have dancers on stage, you want a certain coefficient of friction so actors don't and technicians don't slide on the stages. This gives us a way of doing that. This is specifically about inspections and the logs that we're supposed to keep when we're doing them. So E1.4.1, 2016, the manual counting rate systems, as I mentioned, they tell you what kinds of things need to be inspected in there. The same as with E1.22, the fire safety curtain. They're going to have samples of what those logs should look like within those. One of the things that could happen in terms of OSHA is if you have an accident on your stage and God forbid somebody gets hurt or somebody gets killed, they're going to look to make sure that you have demonstrated due diligence in the execution of that piece of machinery. And when that piece of machinery does not have any kind of a log that you've done the inspections and who did them and what was found when they did them, that's going to be a problem. So this is a way of covering yourself when that comes up. So there's no questions up to this point. I'm going to move right along. I'm sure Christine will tell me if there are any.
I see no questions as of yet, gentlemen.
Okay, great. Okay.
It might be a good time for me to remind people, though, if you don't mind, that if you'd like to enter questions, please use your chat box. If you use your cursor and hover over the bottom of your screen, there should be a chat box option. Type your questions there, and I will monitor them throughout the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. E1.39 is entertainment technology selection and use of personal fall arrest systems on portable structures used in the entertainment industry. Up until this standard was written, we had been making up rules about how we protect technicians who are working on top of suspended truss or working on top of truss systems that are in stages, portable stages. There was not a standard on how to do this. This is the first attempt. It's currently being reviewed and rewritten because we do these every 5 years. Every single standard gets reviewed every 5 years. But it details when we're working on a truss system, when we're dealing with it as a work platform, how do we employ a fall arrest system that will protect the worker, not damage the system should they fall? There's a number of things in here, specifically things about derating the capacity of your motors when they're involved in a fall arrest situation. So, you know, if you have a 1-ton motor and you put 2 workers on there and your fall arrest system is attached through the motor hooks, what does that do to the capacity of the motor? Well, most of them reduce the capacity by 50%, for example. That's one of the things. This standard is used in conjunction with a standard that we did not write, that is an industry standard for all industry, construction in particular, where fall protection and fall arrest systems are to be used. ANSI 359.1, which was written in 2018, the last version, it has 18 sections to it, which is a lot. But among the things to note, it details all the different kinds of hardware that should be used in a fall arrest system. From the body harness to the connectors to the lanyards to the decelerators to the anchor points, things to protect yourself from when you're using those systems and how to employ them in a way that's not going to cause more problems. The big chunk of this standard, the 359.1, has to do with rescue. There's been a lot of studies done and a lot of experience had in the problem of orthostatic intolerance when someone falls and they're hanging in their harness. One of the ways that we combat that is by being able to execute a prompt rescue from someone who has fallen into a fall arrest system. So it's really important that you understand what goes into that. This fall protection and training and a rescue plan have to be in written form, and they need to be practiced. They need to have training, and the training needs to be repeated on a regular basis so the people who are subject to those dangers, those hazards, can be guaranteed that there's this place, there's system in place rather, that will take care of them should they fall into a fall arrest system. So it's a really important standard, and you know, this one is, the 359.1 is not free to download. It's actually relatively expensive, but it's very relevant if you're working in a situation where you're using fall protection of any kind. Yeah.
I have a question before you move on. I think it goes back more towards the fire curtain safety, but
Yes.
the question coming in here is, what, if anything, does ANSI say about deluge systems? We've got a deluge curtain instead of a fire curtain.
They do refer to it in there. The NFP 80 actually puts more verbiage in it as to what it has to do, how long it has to run, what the general purpose is of the deluge curtain. And obviously testing a deluge curtain is a different matter than testing a regular rail curtain or a solid curtain or even a draped curtain. So I would refer to NFP 80 to get the details on that particular one. Off the top of my head, I don't know what the all the parameters are for the deluge curtain. I know that there are a different set of circumstances, and the systems need to be tested on all the parts that lead up to the deluge part of it. So I would refer to NFP 80. The E1.22 will talk about deluge curtains a little bit, but they don't go into great detail about it because that's not the primary focus on it.
Okay, another question, Eddie.
Yeah.
Back to fall arrest. Do you need a fall arrest system for a catwalk or bridge while hanging or focusing lights?
On a catwalk or a bridge, there's supposed to be railings. Those railings have to be 42 inches high. They have to have a top railing, a middle railing, and a toe rail. That the top rail supports 200 pounds outward downward force. The middle rail 150 pounds and the toe rail 50 pounds. If they have those in place, you do not need a fall arrest system or a fall restraint system. Now the difference between the two is a fall restraint system keeps someone from actually getting to the edge and going over the edge. You can employ that instead of a fall arrest system. It's much preferred because you prevent the fall. What I have seen in a lot of theaters, particularly on catwalks, is they take the middle rail out. And in doing so, they violate the standard, the OSHA standard for fall arrest protection, for fall protection, because they don't have that middle rail in there. If the middle rail has been removed and it hasn't been replaced by the pipe from which you hang the lights, which essentially would act as the middle rail, then you need to have some other system in place. Really simple ones, overhead track with a short lanyard that will prevent the person who's dealing with those lights from being able to fall through the hole. That works great. There are some places where we need to have fall arrest systems. Some of our loading bridges don't have any kind of railing on the loading side going into the fly well, the arbor well, and it's possible for someone to fall into the arbor well. Though we're supposed to have either a fall arrest or a fall restraint system to prevent that from happening, and it needs to be used anytime someone's working on that catwalk on the loading bridge. So primarily, we want railings. We want to, first of all, always prevent the fall to begin with, and we can do that with railings. We can do that with fall restraint systems. If we can't do that, then you have to have a fall arrest system, and then the whole ANSI 359.1 regulations are going to come into play. That it?
One more, a follow-up question on that, Eddie. Is there a required height for the middle rail?
Halfway between the top rail and the bottom. That's the OSHA standard.
You can have more than one, but you have to have at least one.
I'm good here now.
Okay,
Eddie?
great. Okay, so moving right along. E1.43 is our attempt to lay out some basic parameters for performer flying systems. Everyone writing this standard recognizes that performer flying is an artistic choice, but at the same time, we don't want to have injuries. We don't want to have fatalities because systems aren't designed correctly. What you're going to find in here is the parts of a performer flying system meet a higher standard than all the other kinds of rigs do. They have to have a minimum of a 10-to-1 design factor, for example. There are some things in here about practice and rehearsals with performers to make sure that they are kept safe while they're preparing to learn how to fly in these systems. You can't just throw a harness on them, haul them up in the air and expect them to know what to do. There's all kinds of musculoskeletal disorders that can come if it's done incorrectly and if they're not in proper condition for them, depending on what you're asking them to do. So while a lot of this is going to fall on the people who design these systems, and there are professional companies who do this, and we always recommend that you use a company like Foy or ZFX or one of the other performer companies, performer flying companies when you do these kinds of effects, because there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. So you want to make sure that we're being responsible when we fly performers. E1.46 is about the prevention of falls from theatrical stages and raised performance platforms. We'll pointed out that OSHA specifically exempts the leading edges of stages. That applies primarily during performances or rehearsals, when actors are on stage, when there's an approximate audience, and the railing would obviously be a problem. There are other ways of keeping people safe while they're working on platforms or they're working on front edges of stages. And this standard is going to go into what those evolve. One of them are nets for orchestra pits, which are becoming more and more ubiquitous, especially on Broadway, because they've had some accidents of actors and lighting designers and stagehands falling into orchestra pits, not only injuring themselves, but musicians. There's a lot of opportunities in our business to fall. This is an attempt, and this was just rewritten in 2018, and there were some changes made to it to prevent those falls. So if you have specific questions about the standard, I would recommend downloading that standard, making sure you understand what it says and that you follow those rules. E1.60, guidelines for rake stages in live performances. I came up in a theater in San Francisco that had a rake stage all the time, every show. And we learned a lot of things about working on a rake stage. Sometimes we learned them well, and sometimes we did not. Sometimes I shudder when I look back at the things we used to do as stagehands back in the day. But it talks about what degree of rake you can have on a stage and what the precautions you should take when you're doing so. This again will get into the slipperiness of the floor, but it also has to do with protecting the audience from things that can roll off of a rake stage into the orchestra pit or into the lap of the people sitting in the first row. So some of those things will be addressed in the standard. Back to 359.1 again. I wanted to bring this up one more time because this really is the Bible for fall protection. And even though it's expensive, institutions should have a copy of this. You can subscribe to the standard and get the updates as they come through. Rescue, evacuation, and evacuation are really, really a big deal. They got added in to the standard in 2012 because they realized that just stopping the fall wasn't nearly enough. Orthostatic intolerance, for those of you who don't know, is the phenomena where blood pools in the legs. It can happen to you if you're just standing up too long in hot weather and you're locking your knees, blood can pull in your legs, and your brain tells you that it wants to be below the heart so that it gets oxygen, and you pass out. The problem is when you pass out in the harness, you don't fall down, so your brain doesn't get below your heart. I just read an article that the Army put out. They've had a fatality in as little as 3 minutes from someone hanging in a fall arrest harness. So we use 10 minutes generally as the rescue time. And if you think about it, there's a lot that goes into rescuing somebody at elevation to get them down to the floor safely, especially if they injured themselves during the fall. So this standard is going to talk about all of those specifics and how to set up your training program for your rescue, how to have a qualified person design what your rescue system is. In 1.42 is the design and installation of orchestra pits. It's a lot of this construction stuff, but it also gets into the inspections and periodic testing, the maintenance on them, and alterations, because God knows we all alter these things one way or another when we're using them just to make our shows work. So it has to do with the associated parts, the rooms that are attached to them, spaces underneath them and above them, hoistways, enclosures, and anytime there's a stage lift. They were very careful in here because you don't want to call them stage elevators. Elevators have a different part of the law that applies to them under most of the building codes. Orchestra pit lifts are different than elevators, and they have a different set of rules, and E1.42 addresses those different rules, both for the construction, but primarily for our interest, for the maintenance and inspection, use, and modification of them. E1.5, get into atmospheric effects here. This started a long time ago, and ESTA was very involved in measuring parts per million of the different kinds of effects that were used on different stage shows. Started on Broadway, but it has since gone out all over the country. They actually have testing gear at ESTA in the technical standards program that you can use to measure the density of the effect in your area. Should you find yourself in that position, that might be a good idea. 1.5 is fog that's made with the aqueous solutions. And it's going to talk about the different kinds of materials that we put into our fog machines, particularly the smoke, what we would refer to as smoke machines. It's also going to talk about the use of other kinds of effects that we do on the stage and what we have to do to make them compliant with the exposure laws as they're listed in OSHA. Subpart Z of OSHA covers all of the things that we can be exposed to, chemicals, and how much of it we can be exposed to at any given time. Remember, especially when we're heating things up and putting them in the atmosphere, we change the molecular structure of these things, and then we inhale them. So we need to understand what it is and how much we can actually do without causing harm. This E1.23 is about the execution of those fog effects on stage, to do with how many of the machines, how many machines we use, how thick the fog is again. E1.29 is the product safety standard for the things that make fog, including the things that use aerosols, water solutions, glycol, glycerin, and refined alkane mineral oil, which is pretty much discouraged nowadays. You know, it's a petroleum product. You put it in the air and you inhale. It's not a good idea. But it'll get into the specifics about what those things are. And finally, our dust effects. Sometimes we use dust effects in theaters. And it talks about the different kinds of materials that you can use in a dust effect and what the effects are on the people who are using them. So we want to make sure that we read this. The guidance in here is a mixture of should and shall. Should means that they recommend a particular practice. Shall means that, especially if OSHA gets involved with it, this is what you have to do when you're doing this particular kind of an effect. So again, you have to read these things thoroughly to make sure you understand them correctly, but it's about the choices we make and what we use to do these kinds of effects. Delve into a little bit on lighting system here. The guidelines for assembly and use of theatrical boom and bass assemblies. God knows we all use boom and bass assemblies. There's a right way and a wrong way to do it. This has to do with the ratio of height to counterweight at the bottom. How do we make sure these things don't fall over? And how do we make sure that we don't drop lights off of them? So this is the design and the use of the boom and bass assemblies that we use all the time. E1.27 has to do with the standard for portable control cables that we use with our lights, particularly with DMX5, and the E1.11 DMX12A products. So this has to do with what kind of cable we're supposed to be using there. Mostly this is going to have to do with the quality of the signal you're going to get through it, not so much the voltage and amperage that we're running through them, because these are low volt systems. There are other parts under the National Electrical Code that dictate what kind of electrical cable we can use for distributing power, for distributing electricity to lights and things like that. Has to do with amperage, has to do with the jacket on the outside, has to do with the fact that they all have to be grounded. We can't use two conductor wire on all of these effects.
Eddie,
Yeah.
before you move on,
Yes.
can we go back for a second?
Sure.
Back to fog machines and such. Where does dry ice fog come in?
That would be in E1.5, the aqueous solutions. They consider the CO2 to be, because it's in a frozen state, it's an aqueous solution. So it's going to fall under that one. The big thing to remember about using CO2 dry ice fog is that it's a simple asphyxiant. It displaces oxygen. If we're using CO2 tanks instead of dry ice, which some of us do when we do these effects, you have to be aware that if we put those CO2 tanks in confined spaces, we need to monitor the amount of CO2 in the atmospheric device. So, because you can't tell that the CO2 has displaced the oxygen in a room. And we've actually had fatalities where people in orchestra pits or trap rooms underneath stages have been overcome and died from suffocated because the CO2 coming out of the tanks that they were using for an effect had displaced the oxygen in those rooms. So that's the big thing about dry ice fog. Speaking, it's relatively safe, except for the wetness you get on the stage sometime. But other than that, they're pretty safe. Okay?
All set, thank you.
Okay. E1.19 talks about the recommended practice for the use of GFCIs, ground fault circuit interrupters. In the entertainment industry, there are a number of times when we are working in places that are damp or working around water, or we have water on the stage in one form or another, and we need to be aware that it is recommended to use GFCIs for all proximate electrical circuits so that we don't have an electrocution. Remember, GFCIs are for personnel protection. They're not for circuit protection, just for personnel protection. So we want to make sure that we understand the parameters around using them. One of the main things to understand about using the Class A GFCIs is we never want to use them on life-critical circumstances. So if you're doing stunts on stage, you probably don't want to have all of your lights on a GFCI because you don't want people who are putting their well-being at risk doing a stunt to then have to be plunged into the dark suddenly. So you need to have backup systems that will run if the GFCI trips. So, but it's a big deal, especially when we're doing outdoor productions where we have the possibility of rain and things. Yes?
Sorry, we're going to go back to fog machines one more time.
Oh, okay.
Does nitrogen fog fall into the same category as dry ice?
Yes, nitrogen is also a simple asphyxiant that will displace oxygen. So it's going to follow, you need to follow the same rules.
Thank you. All good.
Okay. E1.24 came out in 2012, got rewritten in 2017. This is the dimensional requirements for stage pan connectors. And any of old dogs remember that in the old days when you had two different manufacturers of stage pan connectors, one male, one female, they never quite fit properly. They were either too loose or too tight. What they tried to do in E1.24, what they did in E1.24 is they set a standard for manufacturing these things so that they are all compatible. So if you have stage pan connectors that were made before 2012, they should be swapped out for the new ones. Because on the new ones, all the manufacturers use exactly the same dimensions for the diameter of the pins, the length of the pins, and the spacing of the holes. So that you're not going to have any problems with stage pan connectors that weld themselves together or get warm and you can't pull them apart when you're done. So good one to know about. E1.32 is a guide for inspection of the lamps that we use, the incandescent lamps that we use, and we use lots of different kinds of incandescent lamps. But basically what this does is gives us a way to evaluate the safety of those lamps when we do the inspections, the kinds of maintenance that we need to do on them. And it's a supplement to the information that you get from the manufacturers with each lamp. So the manufacturer will come out with their guidelines about what we should be doing in terms of taking care of those devices. But this takes it a little farther and recommends how often they should be inspected, the kinds of things to look for, and what to do about them when you find a problem. So that's pretty much it for the ANSI standards. In fact, that is it for us. So I'd like to open it up for questions here. About 10 minutes left. And we covered an awful lot of material, and I'm sure people have some questions, either about OSHA or ANSI standards, about the application of one to the other. Unless, Joe, you want to fill anything else in here?
Well, I just want to reiterate the fact that being friends with or friendly with your OSHA compliance officers and consultation officers in your area is not a bad thing. They're there as your ally, not as your enemy. And their sole purpose is to make sure that our employers provide us with a safe and healthful workplace. Sometimes our employers don't view that as their responsibility when actually it is, and they need some help in remembering that. So I'm an advocate for talking to the, you don't have to take them out for coffee, but if they come by, you might offer them one. But invite them in and become proactive rather than reactive. The idea that they could walk onto a job site and say, wow, are those guys clipped in up there? Wow, should they be? Yeah, they should be. They're at height or something similar. So it's not a bad idea to have them out and walk them around and explain what you do and how you do it and how frequently you do it and under what circumstances, so that they get an idea. Invite them to a performance so they can see the after effect of all of our hard work. Once we put something up, they can enjoy and have a little knowledge of how it all went together.
Yeah, invite them backstage during a performance or during a load-in. If you're in a supervisory position or you're an administrator, then having that positive relationship with OSHA before something happens, using their services as consultation is a great asset for making sure that we've dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's, and we're not going to get in trouble later should something happen. You know, there are going to be accidents. There's nothing we can do to prevent absolutely every single accident. Human beings, just too clever. You know, they figure out ways around the things we do to try to keep. But if you've done your homework and you've done your diligence and you have a good relationship with your OSHA inspector, that's going to go a long way to proving that you've done what you think can be done. So don't be afraid of them. They're allies. You pay their salaries with your taxes, so take advantage of that.
The other, David Grindle just reminded me that I mentioned earlier fire marshals, and fire marshals are a great group of folks to have on your site. I've used them many times when I've had users of the theater come in and think they own it and that the rules don't apply to them and that they don't need to worry about egress and whatever. And fire marshals,
or blacking out the exit signs.
Oh yeah, and just doing whatever they want because now they're renting it. Fire marshals are good to have. I've called them a couple of times and they've helped me to explain to the people that need a little educating just exactly what the rules are. So fire marshals, OSHA compliance officers, both good groups of people to have on your side.
And OSHA has two kinds of officers. They have compliance officers and they have consultation officers. So the compliance officers are the ones who write the citations and will do violations. The consultation officers are the ones who will come out and walk through your facility with you and point out things that need to be improved, and often make suggestions as to how you can do those improvements.
Christine.
Gentlemen, there are some questions coming in.
Good. Okay.
We're going to go back to electrical safety and guide for inspection of entertainment industry incandescent lamp luminaires.
Yes.
But specifically, this question, is there something similar for LED fixtures?
They're included. There is not yet. They're writing one. I think, if if I'm not mistaken, there is a document in public review. You go to the tsp.esta.org/tsp page, documents in public review there. The way the system works is someone proposes that we need a standard for a particular thing, and the Technical Standards Council then discusses that, weighs the arguments that the person proposing the standard have made. If they decide that it is worthy of writing a standard, which can take a year or two to write some of these standards, so it's a lot of work. If they do, then they will assign that to one of the working groups. The working group will then assign that to a task group who is in charge of writing that particular document. It comes back to the working group over and over and over again until they're happy with it. Then it goes out for a public review. Public reviews go out, they last for a couple of months. The working group then has to resolve all of the comments within the public review process to satisfaction, and then put it out for another public review. And they have to keep doing it until they've addressed all of the concerns people have about the document. Then it gets recommended to go to ANSI to become a standard. ANSI then audits the process to make sure that everybody dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. So the public review thing is very important because we rely on the industry community to make their contributions at that time into the standard to make sure that we are dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's and getting things correct. So check out the public review documents and see if there's something in there about LEDs. I'm pretty sure there is. I know there's an LED working group within the photometrics group, and I think there's one within the control protocols group, LEDs specifically.
Excellent. Changing topics. Do you need MSDS for wood products for scene shop use?
Go ahead.
Well, they're no longer called material safety data sheets. As of 2015, they're called safety data sheets. And that's something that was done globally. It's not something that just happened in the United States. And if the lumber is treated, if it's been treated with a chemical, then you do have to have an SDS. You may find that there is an SDS for untreated lumber. Always a good thing to have on hand because you never know what kind of allergies people have or what kind of reactions they'll have when sawdust is put in the air or when something is burned or used in some way. So my recommendation is that you have an SDS for any product you bring into the shop.
And if for wood products, if you use things like MDF or the specialty plywoods that are used and things, there definitely are SDSs that go with those because of the amount of formaldehyde that is included in those products and other chemicals, especially with preservatives and put in plywood products. So there will be SDSs for those products.
Okay, moving on.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any guidelines for back painting of hard scenery? Is it necessary as a fire reducer?
That falls under the NFP, National Fire Protection Association, and there absolutely are requirements that if you're using materials that are inherently flammable in proximity, which means that they need to be treated. I used to be licensed in the state of California as an applicator for fire retardant. So there can be no bare wood. The bare wood has to be painted and supposed to be painted with a fire retardant paint. And you can get those in almost any color. And you can get them in black and they work great for back painting on things. Fabrics all have to be treated. And there are a variety of products. There are more and more products that are fabric products that are inherently flame resistant and that will pass. But especially if you do a show and you're going to take it someplace else, that all needs to be documented as well with samples from each of the products that used and samples of each of them have been treated with the documentation and the licensing to be done. If you're doing it for yourself and you don't have a fire marshal who's following you around asking for the documentation, you should still get in the habit of documenting those things and using products that are on the market that you can buy. And you can number of dealers who deal with theatrical paints who also sell the flame retardant products.
Thank you. Yet another question. What is the safety standard for a fire pole on stage for actors to use during a performance?
Okay, here's the thing. When we're doing creative things like designing a stage or a set or something like that, we have a lot of leeway in the laws within OSHA to go beyond what is, and the OSHA recognizes that artistic pursuits will involve things that they don't cover. So, for example, if you've ever seen a Cirque du Soleil, if they try to do a Cirque du Soleil show with the laws that fall under OSHA, they just have to, because they can't do that. A fire pole would fall under that category. What you need to be able to demonstrate, should there, because you have to recognize you're putting someone at risk, is you have to make sure that you've done the right training, that you have the right people doing it, and that all of the feasible safety things that you can do ahead of the performance have been done. You need to make sure, obviously, that it's anchored properly, and the people know how to break themselves as they're coming down the pole. There's not going to be a specific rule for that. And again, just like we don't have to have railings on the front of our stages where the orchestra pit is during performances, that doesn't mean that we can be cavalier about the safety of our performers. So the same is going to be true with any kind of an effect we do on stage, whether it's a safety pole or a fire effect or an acrobat acting, performing on stage. So there's no specific OSHA rule about that. And however,
if you get the wrong OSHA compliance officer visiting your theater, they can and will, if they deem it necessary and you can't explain yourself, they will shut you down. They can stop what you're doing. One of the things that we need to remind folks is that while 1910 and 1926 and 1915, 1917, 1918, 1928 cover most of everything in the world, it doesn't cover everything. If there's something that isn't specifically covered in a standard covered by OSHA, ergonomics, for instance, if there's no standard and there isn't a standard for ergonomics, or only suggestions, but OSHA has the ability to cite someone under what they call the general duty clause. And it's the basis for all the regulations that have been written. So I've seen employers say, well, I searched, I had my assistant research, we couldn't find anything OSHA that said we couldn't do this, so you can't cite me. And that's where they pull out the general duty clause and say, aha, I can cite you just for being you if I want to. No, they're not that bad. But the general duty clause will cover things. So you need to be careful that you consult with your OSHA folks and get their input so that you can avoid those kinds of things.
I think you need to be able to demonstrate that you've exercised due diligence when you do those sorts of things. That's the primary thing. It's difficult for us to draw brackets around everything that we do on stage. The whole idea is we want to try new and different things. That's why it's creative. That's what gets us in this business to begin with. But in doing so, we still need to make sure that we're taking all precautions that we can to keep people safe at work. Hope that answers my question. Yeah.
I don't mind staying a little longer to answer questions if you don't.
I don't. Not at all.
I don't.
Okay. We have several more. Should maybe I ask for the questions to cease at this point and we'll finish up these last several?
We'll see how it goes. I'm okay.
Sounds good to me. The next question is about railings, stage sets that have a second floor, such as an interior of a house. Is a rail needed if above 4 feet?
My experience with Cal OSHA in their inspection of the San Francisco Opera was, if the set has done the set in such a way that during performances they do not need railing, then you don't need a railing during rehearsals and dress rehearsals. That's the time when actors are used to the environment they're going to work in. However, if it's more than 6 feet off the floor, because during load, which includes focus and all the rest of the stuff, we generally fall under construction, you're going to need to have a temporary railing for lighting designers and stagehands and other people who are working on the set on the second level. There are out of the box temporary railings you can buy, and you can make your own as well. Just remember, they still have to meet the criteria for fall protection, which is a 200-pound outward downward force on the top rail, 150 in the middle, 50 at the bottom. So.
Okay, now I have 3 more questions that are generally the same, and I'd like to tell our audience that we shortened maybe or lessened the amount of content because we needed to stick to about an hour. These next 3 questions are all about PPE that hopefully we'll get to in a future conversation, but for tonight's purposes, let me kind of read all 3 to you at once because they all have a very similar theme. So what are the requirements for providing PPE, such as fall harnesses, hard hats, etc.? Does my employer have to pay for it? Number 2, are there specific codes for uses of hard hats? Number 3, can you talk a little bit about the rules and guidelines about the use of hard hats, steel-toed shoes, and other common personal protection?
Go, Joe.
Well, yeah. This, first of all, everyone needs to understand that the employer is responsible for identifying all hazards and potential hazards on a work site. So if an employer identifies a hazard, there are 3 ways that OSHA talks about in having them eliminate those hazards. One is to eliminate it completely through engineering controls. That means design it out, replace the process, replace the materials with something that's not hazardous. The second is work practice or administrative controls, which means that you limit the exposure to as few a number of people as possible. So for instance, in a manufacturing plant, if there's a particular machine that makes excessive noise that's damaging to a large number of people, then you limit that operation to a shift where there are fewer people around and fewer people exposed. Not possible in our industry, especially if you're doing a load in on a show. You load in at 6 o'clock in the morning and it's going to load out at 10:30 that night. So sometime during the day, they've got to test the sound system. That means that folks focusing lights, people hanging drops, doing other things will all be exposed to that. So if the employer has done the survey or the survey of the site,
The risk assessment.
A risk assessment, and determine that the only way they can deal with hazard or a potential hazard is through PPE, then the employer is responsible for identifying that PPE and for providing it with some limitations. Hard hats are one of those things that the employer has to provide. Hearing protection, if they've determined that there's a risk of hearing loss, then the hearing protection is another thing they have to provide. Safety glasses have to be provided. Steel-toed shoes, if you're working in electrical or explosive atmospheres, then they have to provide those steel-toed shoes. Otherwise, they can require you to wear them, but they don't have to provide them for you because you can wear them someplace else. Those are considered common items, just like clothing. Cold weather gear, no. Warm weather gear, no. So it's up to the employer to determine what PPE is needed and then to provide it for you. They can't, unless you're a part of a bargaining unit and they've written into a collective bargaining agreement that the employees will provide certain hand tools and PPE, then the employer is responsible for providing it and making sure that it's in good usable working order and that it is replaced when it needs to be.
And in training you how to use it and when to use it and what it's protecting you from.
Yeah, they can't just hand you a hard hat and say, here, put it on. They have to make sure that it fits. They have to make sure that it's in good working condition. Safety glasses, if they're scratched, if you're wearing eyeglasses, then they have to provide you with safety eyeglasses that fit over your eyeglasses and will protect your eyes from impact. Hearing, the same thing. They have to provide it and tell you how to use it. If you haven't had a hearing test, then they're not real sure what to give you. So there has to be some hearing conservation measures taken into account so that you're getting the proper gear, trained how to use it.
Yeah, we will cover the PPE on a future one. I just want to touch on harnesses really quickly. In our industry, it is very common for not just riggers, but for other people who work at height to own harness, often their own rope for hauling and things like that. That is not required by law. It's a convenience for the work to have a harness that that's adjusted to you, that has all the accessories that you want to have for the work that you do and that you're comfortable wearing. If you provide your own harness on a job, the employer is supposed to assign a qualified person to inspect it. It needs to have the ANSI 359.1/2012 stamp on it, and it needs to meet the criteria needed to address the hazard the employer has determined you're at risk of, so that it will keep you safe. And then they're supposed to train you on how and when to use it. And fall protection is its own subject. We can spend 2 hours talking about protection. But I just want to touch that. You can, and many of us do, provide our own harnesses. If you do, the employer then is responsible for making sure that it meets the standard.
The other side of that is, though, they don't have to allow you to use your own.
Right.
The best approach is not to be horsey about it and say, I'm not going to wear yours, I'm wearing mine only. The approach is, hey, is it okay if I use mine? You're welcome to inspect it. I know where it's been. It's fitted to my body. I'm more comfortable using this harness. And generally the employers will say yes, but they can't require you to furnish your own.
Okay.
Anything else?
Moving on. Yes, sir. Is there a basic list of safety data sheets related to the theatrical production somewhere?
Yeah, it's called Google. Unfortunately, everybody uses different products. If you're on some of the chat sites that I'm on, people ask, what paint are you using to paint your floor? And you get 14 answers with 14 different products, and each one of those products has their own SDS. So it's up to you, if you're a supervisor or a manager or management, to assemble and have those SDSs available to your workers. You can make them available online, but you have to give 24/7 access to the computer, and they have to have online access so that you can do that. My preference is to have printed because I'm old and retired, and I like paper, and I just always think that it's easier to go to a book and find something in a hurry if you don't want to fumble through the internet.
Well, that if you're in a situation where you have an emergency with a power outage, you're not going to be able to do that. So, for example, in 1989 earthquake, there was no cell service, there was no electricity, there was no computer service. And if there was a spill that was caused by the earthquake, you need to look up what's my emergency response supposed to be for this chemical. The place you're going to find that is the SDS, so you should have a version of it.
Okay, I have one more question here, and it goes back to the back painting.
Yes.
Does mixing a fire retardant into paint satisfy that requirement, or needing a fire retardant back paint?
There are products that you can mix into paint. You have to follow the manufacturer's recommended guidelines when you do it, but there are products you can get for that purpose. If you have a specific kind of paint you want to use, you need to talk to the people who sell the fire retardant products. They're all over you can buy it in bulk. There's a dry product you can mix in with some paints that will do the same job. It's basically a particular kind of salt that's built into it. So there are other products, I'm sure, as well. But I don't know what the cost difference is between the additive or the paint itself. The paint was always fairly reasonable.
All right, gentlemen, I have no more questions here. Do you guys want to say just something real quickly about OSHA 10 or OSHA 30 classes? I know you're teaching them all the time, and Nevada requires, now I don't know where it is. I don't know if Nevada requires OSHA 10 or OSHA 30 or what.
They require both. And the difference is the OSHA 30 is recommended for heads of departments, leads, and supervisors, people who make decisions in hiring and firing process and who do the work, who guide people's work. The OSHA 10 is just required for general workers. In Nevada, pardon me?
Okay, go ahead. We lost you there for a minute.
Oh, okay. In Nevada, you have to have a card. The employer has to have proof of a card within 15 days of your being employed. If you have come in on a touring show and you're going to be here for any length of time, you got to have a card. And the cards are good. It doesn't matter where you get it. You can get one in New York. You can get one in California. They're good for life. Nevada only recognizes them for 5 years. And then there's a renewal process that they haven't determined yet. But there's a renewal process that you'll have to go through to renew the card. And they're telling us that it's probably going to be a 5-hour class for the 10 and a 15-hour class for the 30. So.
And the OSHA 10 classes, there's lots of places you can get them. If you go on to the OSHA.gov website and you look at training, it will have a list of outreach training institutes, OTIs, that you can go through to get those. I know Joe was getting ready to teach an OSHA 10 at USITT this year before it was canceled. The two of us have done lots of OSHA 10s and about a dozen OSHA 30s now, I think, Joe, right?
Right.
We're on the curriculum for the OSHA 10 construction. So the difference between what you're going to get anywhere else in the classes that we teach is and this isn't an advertisement, is that ours are directly, as much as possible, directly associated with entertainment industries and how the rules apply to our industry. Lots of industry examples, and we tell a lot of stories about things that happened and how the laws would have applied to them had they been used.
We're not authorized to do online teaching. There are only about 7 entities in the United States that are allowed to offer online classes. My experience with online classes, people take them all the time if they can't get into a class that's being offered by their IA local or some other means. My experience is that it takes you, let me say this. I took the OSHA 30 online just to see what it was like. It took me 70 hours to complete it. And
he's an outreach instructor.
And I'm an outreach instructor, and I've taught it numerous times.
Right.
There's just a difference between online and in person. We can't, one of the things that we're not going to be allowed to do is to do an OSHA 10 or OSHA 30 webinar because we don't have permission from OSHA to do that. That's one of the things that you'll have to find a trainer. And I would just throw out that there are a number of OSHA trainers within the Institute. So I know David Glowacki is an outreach trainer, and I'm trying to think who else.
Mike Murphy.
Mike Murphy is an outreach trainer with Marshall University. I can't think of names escape me. And yeah, there are other people around the country that are available to teach these. If you contact one of us, we usually, if it's for an educational institution, we usually make a pretty decent deal for those folks because we come from that background, and it's being old and retired and white and gray, and it's my opportunity to give back. So I've done for a number of universities, and it would be happy to help you or help you find someone to do it myself.
Okay.
Okay. I think I can say safely that if you have any other questions, feel free to email me at christine@usitt.org. We can help you get more answers for OSHA, your questions answered for the OSHA theme, or be your resource on other topics. If we have nothing else, I'll say thank you, Joe, and thank you, Eddie. USITT will continue to offer online education through live webinars and our recorded offerings in the Innova platform, which you can find at usitt.org. Given the necessity of canceling our 2020 annual conference, we are working to bring some of those sessions online in a format similar to this one. Please be on the lookout for more opportunities in the coming weeks. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Hey, y'all.